Welcome back, everyone. This is Professor Michael Sigman in the Philosophy Department at East Los Angeles College, and today we're going to be talking about the crucial political philosophy of John Stuart Mill, particularly in his work called On Liberty. Mill's a very interesting character in that he was a child prodigy. Mill allegedly could read and write and understood the ancient Greek language by the age of 3. He spoke several languages by his early childhood. His father was an intellectual guy named James Mill, and his father had a very interesting theory about raising children that ultimately pushed his son, John Stuart Mill, to become this great intellectual. And it's really a fascinating story. There's some upside and there's some downside, and I invite you to look into Mill's biography a little bit more if you ever get a chance. Okay, so today we are focusing on one of the two really centerpieces of the Western history of ideas that were both offered by John Stuart Mill. Mill is quite famous for his work in ethics, in the field of ethics, where he expounded upon a theory that was very popular among the British empiricists, particularly in the 18th century, and 19th century, sorry, and that position came to be known ultimately as utilitarianism. Prior to Mill, the chief proponent of utilitarianism was a friend of his father's, a guy named Jeremy Bentham. But Mill took that idea of Jeremy Bentham and really tweaked it into a kind of ethics that is more palatable, I guess you would say. People enjoy it a little bit more. They think it's a little bit more sophisticated than what Bentham had offered. And the chief difference is that what Mill does is he emphasizes intellectual activity over just the base or lower order pleasures, or just the pleasures of the body. We'll get to that. We'll see that plays a role in our analysis today. So besides his work called Utilitarianism, Mill also wrote this work called On Liberty, from which our reading selection comes today. First thing to note is that Mill sort of makes a distinction in On Liberty that he didn't actually use the terminology that we use today. It's a latent contribution in that the boundaries for what today we call positive rights and negative rights were laid down by Mill, but he didn't use the exact terminology that we use today. Today we talk about the distinction between positive rights on the one hand and negative rights on the other. And so let's see what the difference is between those. Negative rights, which some believe are more fundamental than positive rights, negative rights are cases where we claim that, for example, others have a right not to do certain things to me. So they are, in essence, prohibitions on the actions of others towards me. So they say, basically what negative rights say is, leave me alone. Don't take my stuff like that. So a negative rights claim then would be something like claiming a right to life. I'm not talking about the abortion jargon use of that expression, but what a negative rights claim, claiming a right to life would entail is that I have a right for you not to take my life, to kill me. Other rights claims might be things like property rights. That is, I have a right for you not to take my things. Or I have a right for you not to control my body. I have a right for you not to tell me what I should think or what I should say. So if you were listening to the way that I express these negative rights, You may have come across already the source of that word, negative. These types of rights are called negative in that they typically are expressed using the word not. So somebody else has an obligation not to do certain things to me. So what negative rights, or what these types of rights claims say, is leave me alone, let me be. In contrast, positive rights claims, what they are going to argue is that not that you shouldn't interfere with me, but that someone has to provide for me in certain respects. These types of rights claims are saying, again, they don't say leave me alone. What they say is, I deserve to have something provided for me by society. So see if you can think of any positive rights claims that we might make today, that society should provide X, Y, or Z for us. Here are some examples. Are there any of these ones that you thought of? Things like a good education or a good public education, or the means to a tolerable standard of living, claiming a right to public transportation, claiming a right, and here's a very important one today, claiming a right to health care, right? Some will argue that society must provide affordable and proficient health care to its citizens, which of course does not say, leave me alone. I'm really sick, so go ahead and leave me alone. That's not what it's saying. What it's saying is that our society owes it to all of its citizens to provide for us healthcare options that we can access. So there's a distinction then between negative rights and positive rights. Now, as I alluded to earlier, Mill, in his work in ethics, emphasized the importance of challenging yourself intellectually. That is, becoming a more developed human. And in his ethical views, Mill, in fact, took a look at different types of activities that are pleasurable, and he argued that intellectual pleasures are qualitatively superior to sensual or bodily pleasures. So he's not talking about just there's more of them. What he's talking about is that they are of such a different type, a superior type, that being such as ourselves, we would be unwilling to trade any quantity of these low-order bodily pleasures for our higher, more qualitatively superior pleasures, like, let's say, pursuing an education and achieving your goal. Compare something like that day that you graduate, compare something like that to, let's say, eating candy. Now, candy is fine, it gives us sensual pleasure, but it's a very sort of easily accessible pleasure and one that we don't place too much value on, at least I hope we don't. And if you go through the process of setting high goals for yourself and through an intellectual effort and deliberation, you achieve something that you might not have expected that you could achieve, the pleasure that you get from that is not really even comparable to these pleasures like eating candy, because those candy eating pleasures, they're very, very simple, they're very, very accessible, and in the long run, they really mean very little to us. Excuse me. So for Mill, intellectual pleasures, that is, the types of activities that engage us on really on deep emotional levels and challenge us intellectually, this is where we find our dignity, really. So, I'm going to apply that here with Mill to the realm of political philosophy. And what he's going to ask, or what we're going to ask of our society then, is what would really be the worst thing that a system of government could do to the individual person? And Mill's answer is that the worst thing that a government could do would be to restrict our intellectual options, because really it takes away from us the opportunity to live a fully realized human life. Okay, well, how would that actually happen? How could our intellectual options be restricted by a government? In some forms of government, in the history of humanity, it's been pretty obvious. That is, just a system of government is instituted with the specific design to prevent people from participating in intellectual activities. One example, just one, would be the former Soviet Union. The former Soviet Union used to ban books, a lot of books, and as you know, some states in the U.S. still are involved in this practice. Um, so, in particular, they ban things like religious texts. So, in a state like that, the state is actually taking away our opportunity to engage in these intellectual activities by design. Mill worried that our intellectual options could be restricted in more open societies as well, and especially in a democracy. How so? Well, one way is through what Mill calls the tyranny of the majority. That is, the majority, or public opinion, and he sort of changes in our reading on liberty between talking about majority opinion and public opinion, and for him that really sort of means the same thing. What he argues here is that, especially in a democracy, it's possible for the majority to vote, to enact laws that prevent groups or individuals from doing what they want. And here we can think of something like the ballot proposition system that's in place in now a number of states, but in the state of California. And we should note that although sort of it's accepted practice now, that ballot proposition system itself is constitutionally dubious. I mean, it has a shaky foundation because the purpose of laws really is to protect all of the citizens. So if you get the majority that keeps sort of ganging up on the minority and putting its laws and enforcing them on the minority when the minority doesn't want them, then you have an oppressive system of government. So, I mean, imagine if laws were put into place that said things like you can't do X because you are just the wrong race, or you're the wrong class, you're the wrong gender, maybe you have the wrong religious affiliation. Uh, if there's a minority group that holds these minor positions, and the majority just says, let's get together and vote on it, and the majority all votes as a block, then what can the minority do, right? So the tyranny of the majority, that is, the majority is acting as a tyrant. This actually represents quite a problem for Mill, because Mill is a utilitarian, and utilitarians, and again, this is from ethics, utilitarians believe that our moral obligation in every case is to produce, and perhaps you've heard this expression before, to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. Our obligation is to, in other words, create the best overall outcome, not just for ourselves, but for everyone that's involved in society. So, one criticism of utilitarianism is, and the literature is just full of interesting short stories and more developed novels and so forth that really push this extreme. What if making one person or one group a slave to a lot of other people in the society, what if that produces a net increase in happiness over unhappiness across the whole society? If that's the case, then utilitarianism, this moral theory, actually demands that we have to do it as a matter of obligation. So there is tension in Mill's thought already. Because on the one hand, you see, he's saying to us that majorities should not oppress minorities. But on the other hand, he's saying we have an obligation to do what's for the best for the most people. So it looks like he's sort of speaking against himself in a sense. And again, we'll get to that in just a moment. The tyranny of public opinion, though, is actually his greatest fear. So we talked about how states can just arbitrarily put laws in that say you can't do this or that. We also talked about how in something like a democracy, voting by majority can lead to oppression. But what Mill ultimately winds up saying is that no matter what form of government you're in, the laws that are in place there may or may not be effectual. What really influences our lives and what really serves as the most oppressive force in our lives is the interactions that we have with the people around us in our daily practices. So the feedback that we get from those in our community, from our friends, our neighbors, our family, our peers, and the like, that feedback can be even more oppressive than any law that the state could possibly make. So these are cases where maybe it's not illegal, but the people in your community, the people in your surroundings, the people that you interact with on in your daily lives, that they can set standards for you where you're just not allowed to do certain things or say certain things or act or think in certain ways because the people in your surroundings find that type of behavior offensive or unworthy or degrading or just useless. As an example, in contemporary American society, it's not quite as bad as it was before, but think of something like calling yourself an atheist. That is openly calling yourself an atheist and supporting the idea of atheism. A lot of people don't like that. And imagine the kind of negative feedback that someone who's openly atheist would receive. Maybe in your life, imagine that you went around espousing atheism, and think of the people in your lives who would react very negatively to that. I know, for example, some of my relatives would just stop talking to me if I told them that I was an atheist or something. So the pressure really to fit in, the pressure to conform to public opinion, to majority opinion in your environment, is, Mill argued, really the antithesis of intellectual freedom. It prevents us from free thought. So, besides atheism, you might, besides espousing atheism, you might think of other types of thoughts or actions or beliefs that there's nothing illegal about them, but those in your community would react so negatively that you would really have to hide your behavior or hide your beliefs to avoid that kind of negative feedback. Think of your own examples. One example might be something like witchcraft, right? There are actually a lot of people who subscribe to various types of witchcraft, but if you go around talking about that in certain parts of your natural environment, people are going to get really, really upset with you. So, not illegal, but frowned upon by society. And Mill argued that that really is even more oppressive than the laws that the state can make. All right, Mill. So, we have threats to individual freedom. How then should we proceed? What Mill maintained is that it's it's incumbent upon us to ensure in some way the freedom of the individual, the freedom of minority groups, but also, and Mill takes it even further, ensuring that each individual citizen has freedom to, as we'll see, think what they want. That is, what he's arguing, neither the government nor the general public should determine for you what the good is. So if you think that this is what's important in life, the government shouldn't be able to tell you that that's wrong, nor should the people in your community. So, what Mill winds up concluding is that negative rights should be protected and upheld, because what they do is they ensure individual freedom. But he's not such a fan of positive rights, because he argues that positive rights should be rejected, because to uphold a positive right is to presuppose, that is to suppose in advance, that something, some outcome or some state of affairs is actually something that you want, something that you conceive of as part of the good life. And Mill argued that that's really contradictory, because positive rights, they demand that some acts be provided for us, and in doing that, they weaken the notion of rights altogether. Because rather than emphasizing freedom, which negative rights do, what positive rights do is they emphasize a dependency. They emphasize dependence on some idea of what the good life is for all of us. So Mill, then, is a champion of negative rights. Remember, negative rights say, leave me alone, which is an expression of freedom, right? Saying, let me be free. And because of their very different tenor, Mill rejects positive rights, because he thinks that they assume too much about what actually is good for us. That creates, though, some real tension in Mill's views. And in particular, it comes down again to the conflict that he has between his ethical utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, and his political philosophy, which, sort of on the other side of the spectrum, tells us, no, the majority has to back off and let the individual live their own lives. The main problem for Mill, in the end run, or in the end of things, is people who just don't want to experience what he called the higher pleasures. Because what he's going to argue really is that the higher pleasures is what life's all about. So when you have these sort of low-aiming fools, how to get them to find true happiness without forcing them to do so. His position is, and he's got to reconcile this, that these low-aiming fools, they must be shown the error of their ways. So we have to, in some way, force them, for their own good, to engage in the types of activities that lead to experiences of higher pleasures. What he maintains is that once they have been exposed to these higher pleasures, they're going to figure out that, I've been wrong all along, and I need to change my goals in life. They will recognize, in other words, what they've been missing, and they'll change their minds. The conflict in Mill's thought is, and we've sort of spelled that out already, that forcing people to engage in certain activities, like maybe going to school, or some would argue going to church, forcing people to do these kinds of things appears to be a violation of their negative rights not to be interfered with in shaping their own lives, their own conceptions of what's valuable in life. And this is a restriction on individual liberty that Mill said that we absolutely must respect. We cannot do that as a group. So how's he going to, on the one hand, say, you got to leave people alone, but then on the other hand, say we have to force people to experience these greater these qualitatively superior pleasures, so that they know what the good life really is all about. It seems like an uphill battle. However, he thinks that he does have a way to resolve this conflict. Excuse me. And just we're going to see it crop up again a little bit later. But in case you're curious, Mill's resolution has to do with the distinction between adulthood and childhood, for example. That is, once someone is an adult, we do have to step back and let them live their own lives. But in their formative years, when they're young, that's when it's really our task as a society to expose them to a variety of different ideas so that they can be in a position to make good judgments. And maybe this sort of, maybe when you were a kid, your school even did things like this, introduced new ideas and had special days that celebrated people you'd never heard of, and so the school was really opening your eyes to something that perhaps you'd never seen before. Or some schools will take kids on field trips. On field trips, you'll go to things like museums, or you'll go to art galleries, or I remember when I was a kid, I grew up in the Bay Area, and they took us one time when I was in, I don't know, third grade or something. They took us to watch the San Francisco Ballet. Just imagine all these little 8-year-olds who were, trying to appreciate ballet. Not too many of the kids were super appreciative. Nevertheless, the idea behind that is that you have to plant the seeds of culture. Now, whether they grow, that's a matter of the individual and the individual's parents, I suppose. But at least showing kids what's out there opens their minds and gets them to think reflectively on what has value, rather than just assuming from day one that this is right and this is wrong. Okay. On liberty, the reading selection that you were given, and it's been edited by me. That is, it's a much longer work, and so I grabbed and put into your reading package some of the most critical points. On Liberty is considered really just a foundational work in modern democratic theory. That is, the theory of how a democracy would work. Although it does not represent what we'd call contemporary American liberalism, and it does not represent the platform of the Democratic Party in the United States, which in contemporary political debate, people will say, oh, liberals means you belong to the Democratic Party, for example. And that's not what's going on here. In fact, Mill is what we would call, in political philosophy, we would call him a classical liberal. And what that means is that in conflicts of interest between the state and the individual, in conflicts of interest between a group or a community and an individual, Mill sticks up for the individual. He's going to try to carve out a safe space, you might say, for individual liberty, to ensure that each person has the room to think for themselves and to really to mature, to grow intellectually. Again, he emphasizes human development. He is what we would call then a political individualist. And we can think of on the scale of political philosophy, the opposite of a political individualist would be someone that we'd call a communitarian. Not a communist, a communitarian. A communitarian believes that when it comes down to conflicts of interest between the individual and the group, whether the group be just society or whether it be the government. A communitarian will say that the final authority goes to the community, not to the individual. Mill, he wants the individual to hold the final say. Political individualism is widely taken for granted today. In Western democracies, we think that this is something that kind of you have to have it. But it has not always been the case. I mean, in the history of ideas, political individualism is really rather new. And it's an interesting combination of philosophical ideas that got put together from different areas of philosophy. And one way of tracing it back, I mean, one way of making the case for political individualism, you can start with someone like our old buddy Descartes. Descartes, remember, said that each individual has the ability to think for herself or himself. In fact, Descartes said, the fact that we can think is what defines us as humans. Then, along came people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, who were political theorists, and the cases that they made was that individual agents then can make, and in fact, tracing back the history of political association, they always have made rational decisions that lead to and justify things like the social ordering that we have and the authority that we allow the state to have over us. So they took Descartes' idea that rationality is at the core of humanity, and they said rationality actually explains the history of social association throughout the history of humanity, and it explains how we got to where we are now. It's all a matter of rational decision making. And Mill comes along then and says, okay, that means then that the state really has to respect that rational citizen. And this is, in a way, sort of borrowing from someone that people believe is really sort of a contrary position to Mill, a guy named Immanuel Kant. Kant argued for the autonomy of the individual, that each individual deserved respect, precisely because we have this unique capacity for rational thought. Well, Mill is actually a kindred spirit here. He's arguing that there's something unique about rational beings that even a state, even a government, has to recognize that it needs respect. Okay, so we turn then to, finally, the text that you read for On Liberty. And again, we took a small portion of a much larger work. And one of the great things about On Liberty is that Mill doesn't really mess around. He kind of jumps right in there and tells you what he's all about. In the opening paragraph, it's just packed full of important information. And so we find out right away, what's he trying to claim here, and what's his whole work trying to defend. And it turns out, right, that, as you read, the main idea that he's trying to assert and defend is that the only time that the state or the community can step in and infringe upon the individual's freedom is in cases of self-protection. So only when the state has to protect itself from the individual, only when the community has to protect itself from the individual, can we restrict that individual's freedom. So as long as the individual stays in their own sphere, and this is a word that Mill's going to use later, as long as the individual keeps to themselves, then they have a complete right. They have sovereignty, you would say. When can society invoke those limits? When can society say, okay, now you've hit a boundary and you can go no further? And Mill very famously draws it out, again in that very first paragraph, by specifically stating that it is harm to others. harm to others. This is known as Mill's harm principle. So individual freedom stops when there's going to be harm to others. Notice that he doesn't just say harm in general. And there's a reason for that. Because if he just said harm in general, then what he worried was that would be open to abuse. Because that would, one way we can interpret it, for example, is to say harm to oneself, right? So we're going to step in and take away your freedom so that you don't harm yourself. That's dicey. That is something that Mill is not willing to go along with. Because what's to stop, let's say, your community from telling you how to live your life for your own good? Imagine that you live in a group of really strong believers in religion who believe that if you don't live your life a certain way, then you're going to go to hell. And they want to, and you're not following those rules, right? And so they say, for your own good, that is, to prevent you from harming yourself, we're going to force you to adopt our practices for your own good. That is not allowed. So what Mill said is, you got to leave the individual alone to make those types of decisions about what's in their own good, what's in their own welfare. But when the individual is going to harm others, that is when society can invoke the limit. Okay, now we get to something that really needs explanation. And you may have come across this and highlighted it, or it, hopefully it piqued your interest. To whom does Mill's doctrine of liberty apply? So this kind of extensive liberty, that protection of the individual, who gets that kind of freedom? Well, Mill puts down, and this is, you find it in the second paragraph of your reading selection. So if you're going along with me, you might want to take a look at your at the reading. So you can pause the video or something to make sure that you're reading along with me. Okay, so in that second paragraph, Mill specifies that there are limits on who gets this kind of extensive liberty. First off, you have to be an adult. So that resolves the problem of children, right? His resolution long ago to get out of his conflicting doctrines. You have to be an adult. You have to be in possession of your full mental faculties. So we don't give complete freedom to people who are insane. We don't grant it to people who have deep psychological problems. We don't grant it to people who are not mature. And we find all of these distinctions very early on in the second paragraph. So it makes sense, right? That is, you have to wait until the individual has sort of deserved this kind of freedom, in that they have blossomed into a rational being, a fully rational being. Okay. However, in that same paragraph, about halfway down, or let's see, depending on what you're looking at, let's call it line 6 or something like that. About line 6, we see this line that should have triggered your justice filter here. I'm going to read directly from the text with you. For this same reason, we may leave out of consideration those backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered as its non-age. Okay, in that context, non-age means disqualifying factor, like you're not old enough or you're not mature enough, right? But what was the word that really sort of triggered ideas for us that something bad's being said here, and that's the word race, of course, because to the modern reader, this sounds like Mill is saying only certain races deserve this kind of freedom. So it seems to be overtly racist. Yeah. Well, to the modern reader, that's the obvious read. However, at Mill's time, the word race was used in a very different way. So although saying this with the word race used as we use it today is blatantly racist, during Mill's time it was not. Because the way that they used the word race in Mill's culture at that time was the way that we use, in fact, the word culture today, which is different, right? Race and culture are not the same things. Because you can have members of the same race be members of different cultures. What Mill's arguing then is that there are certain cultures that, because of the way that they operate, prevent their citizens from becoming fully mature, rational agents. And again, we kind of wonder, who are these cultures? I mean, he has to tread finely here. In fact, what Mill argues, and I'm going to just read along the next couple of lines because they're so critical. The next sentence says, "The early difficulties in the way of spontaneous progress are so great, so great. We have such barriers to overcome with these uncivilized cultures that there is seldom any choice of means for overcoming them, and a ruler full of the spirit of improvement is warranted in the use of any expedients that will attain an end perhaps otherwise unattainable. Despotism, that is, complete control over the individual, every aspect of the individual's life. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided that the end is their improvement and the means are justified by actually achieving that goal." Okay, barbarians, huh? All right, what Mill's arguing then is that when you're dealing with barbarians, then you can infringe on their freedom because you need to uh, expose them to culture. You need to make them become cultured, as we would say. So here the parallel is that barbarians are like children. Or I guess if you have children, maybe you've already made this connection before, that children are barbarians. So what does it mean for one group or one culture to be barbarian and the other to be sophisticated and advanced? Again, he still sounds like he's on thin ice in terms of being racist. Well, if you keep reading in that paragraph, though, you see his answer very, very quickly. And that is, he argues that barbarians are people who have not yet achieved the ability. And so I'm here. Let's take a look at the last line, the last sentence of this paragraph, and also a similar sentiment shows up 2 lines previous. But as soon as mankind have attained the capacity of being guided to their own improvement by conviction or persuasion, a period long since reached in all nations with whom we need here concern ourselves, compulsion, either in the form of, or in that, either in the direct form or in that of pains and penalties for non-compliance, is no longer admissible as a means for their own good, and justifiable only for the security of others. As soon as the group is able to improve themselves just by talking, just by having rational discussions, as long as the group is willing to sit down and listen to one another and together, collectively, come to a decision that follows principles of rationality. I mean, there are no threats of harm involved here. As long as people give others the benefit of the doubt and are willing to change their minds if reason calls for it, then the doctrine of liberty does apply. Before that, however, that is, when people aren't willing to listen to others, when people aren't open to the possibility that what they believe might be wrong, they should not be granted this kind of extensive liberty that we're talking about. So it makes you think of, not just the American Congress or our current president or something, people who don't listen, but think about friends that and family that you have. That which ones do you find to be sort of more civilized, and which ones do you find to be just lost causes? Those lost cause ones, one of the common denominators is they never listen. They are absolutely sure that they're right from day one, and no matter what counter evidence comes against them, they're just not going to change their minds. They will, in fact, resort to force rather than listen. And for Mill, that denotes them as being, in his words, a barbarian, or perhaps better, just being uncivilized. So we find out then, to get this kind of protection that Mill's talking about, to deserve it, you have to be an adult, you have to be civilized, open-minded, in other words. You also have to have your full mental capacities. You have to have the ability to take care of yourself. So there are some restrictions that he puts on the doctrine of liberty, but in the vast majority of cases, people will qualify. All right, so for Mill then, the doctrine of liberty applies with some conditions. He then makes a famous distinction between what he starts to call the public sphere and the private sphere. And here, from our reading selection, I invite you to jump down to the beginning of paragraph number 4. And it starts with, "But there is a sphere of action." Okay, so let me read that critical first line. "But there is a sphere of action in which society, as distinguished from the individual, has, if any, only an indirect interest, comprehending all that portion of a person's life and conduct which affects only himself, or, if it affects others, only with their free, voluntary, and undeceived consent and participation." This is, for Mill, the private sphere. This is what he calls the private sphere of our lives. Again, what is the private sphere? It is all that portion of your life and your conduct that affects only you. Or, if it also affects others, it does so with their, notice, with their free, voluntary, and undeceived consent and participation. So, you are free to do what you want, as long as it only affects you. Or, if it affects other people, as long as they are willing participants. If they participate and they agree to it, freely, voluntarily, and without any deception, and you might even throw in without any coercion, without being forced to do so, right? Because you can put a gun to someone's head and say, do you volunteer to give me your wallet? And they're going to say, yes, I do. That's not being truly free. So what Mill says is if this person knows what's going on and there's nothing restricting their freedom, and yet they still say, yeah, I'm down with this, I will participate, then this is still your private sphere. Which means, in contrast, that the public sphere is that part of your life and that part of your conduct that does not just affect you, it affects others. And it affects others without their free, voluntary, and undeceived consent and participation. So these are acts that you have, that you participate in, that have effects on other people that they weren't really aware of. They weren't aware of the fact that you were going to involve them. They never agreed to be a part of this. What Mill argues is, in the private sphere, the state has no right. In the private sphere, as he puts it earlier on, the individual is sovereign, is the ruler, has the ultimate authority. But in the public sphere, the government can restrict your behavior. It is justified in doing that. So here we have that distinction between the private sphere and, of course, negative rights, and the public sphere. Okay, so what are some of the key ideas for a functional society, and one that we would consider to be free, the one that we would really want to join in with if we care about freedom? What Mill argues is that there are three absolutely essential liberties that a society has to protect in order to qualify as a desirable, free society. Three liberties. One is the freedom of conscience. The freedom of conscience. And that includes for him, and this is a rather a large category, it includes for him the idea of freedom of speech. So you should be free, in other words, to think what you want and to say what you want. And the state has to respect that. Secondly, and it's an odd expression, the state has to protect your freedom of tastes and pursuits. That is, the state can't tell you, oh, you like chocolate ice cream. Believe me, you like chocolate ice cream. But not just physical tastes. Also, types of activities. They can't force you to like soccer, to like football. They can't say you must become an air conditioner mechanic. You must become a pilot or something. They can't tell you what you're going to pursue in life, and they can't tell you what kinds of things you prefer over others. Which is curious, right? Because he also has earlier told us that not all pleasures are the same. And thirdly, freedom of assembly. That the state must protect the individual's right to get together with her peers. That we should be able to get together this is how you create a civilized society, is by getting together and discussing. Now, it's an interesting question how that applies to something like the internet, where people are communicating freely, it appears to be, and that develops into a community. But whether or not that promotes civilization has to take into account things like intentional spreading of disinformation. So sometimes, in other words, people are being deceived on the internet and they don't know it. So that, according to his private sphere, public sphere distinction, that type of disinformation spreading should be restricted, because it's not just in the private sphere. Now it's actually in the public sphere. Of these three, Mill is best known for defending the first of these essential liberties. And it's really a classic argument that he makes for the defense of freedom to think as you will and to say what you want. In fact, he starts calling it, as you see in your reading, uh, he starts calling it the liberty of thought and discussion. It's equivalent to what we called freedom of conscience, freedom of the way that you think and what you value, and freedom of speech, right? That is what you can say and discuss publicly. And why is it so important for a desirable society to protect this liberty of thought and discussion? I mean, aren't there cases where people say things that are harmful? Aren't there cases where people are spreading hatred through their words? Well, what Mill's going to argue is that this is the better path. That the liberty of thought and discussion actually has to be protected. And he gives quite a few different reasons for why. Famously, he gives, in particular, 4 reasons. So, one reason, and here what he's talking about really is protecting not just your right to say something, but your right to say things that don't agree with majority opinion. These sort of non-mainstream views, these unique voices, these, as we would say in politics, these dissenting opinions. Those need to be protected, is his argument. And the first reason he gives is that if we don't allow these non-mainstream views to be heard, and it turns out that they're true, then our suppressing them makes society lose out on the truth. And to do so, that is to make the assumption that our mainstream views are always true and should never be questioned, assumes that we are infallible, that is, that we never make mistakes. And that is just crazy, considering that history has shown us over and over and over again that we've made enormous errors in how the world operates. So think of someone like Galileo, right, who was excommunicated from the Catholic Church for not espousing their mainstream view of the world. The Catholic Church, by the way, got around to giving a pardon to Galileo over his view that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but the Sun rather was the center of the universe. It took them until the 20th century, however, to forgive him for that heresy. Okay, so if the non-mainstream view is true, then if we don't let it be heard, we all lose. Reason number 2 is that even if this non-mainstream view, even if it's false, then there's still something good to be gained by having it around. So Mill wants to protect these non-mainstream views because they might be true, but he even wants to protect them even if they're false. Because having false opinions around and having poor lines of argument around, mixing them in with true ideas and strong arguments, forces us to develop a filter on what it is that's going to get adopted into our belief set and what we're going to screen out. This is a sort of a proto-argument of what the common expression is today in higher education, to become a critical thinker. This is a term that was developed in the field of philosophy long ago and has, and like most philosophical ideas, has been stolen by other departments and championed by other departments long since. But having, even if these non-mainstream views are false, it's still good for us to have them out there, because it forces us to think about the difference between right and wrong, the difference between truth and falsity, which is something that, interestingly, in the American public debate now, it is being intentionally undermined, which is absolutely nefarious. Reason number three is that rarely does any one opinion express the whole truth. So, maybe our mainstream beliefs are not wrong, but maybe they're just incomplete. And our mainstream beliefs could be strengthened, could be improved by introducing new ideas, by adding on with these unique ideas. So again, we cannot just stop people from expressing ideas that don't go with the flow, that don't go along with common thought. Because, hey, maybe they might be right. Because, hey, even if they're wrong, it still forces us to become critical thinkers. And reason number three, because, maybe part of what they're saying is right and we didn't think of that before. Finally, reason number four, and I'll put this as succinctly as possible, is that without contest, the result is dogma. Without contest, the result is dogma. Without being challenged, in other words, the result is, do you know what dogma is? Dogma is when you believe something and never question it. You just accept it as true without question. What Mill argues is that dogma is a bad thing. And generally in philosophy, dogma is considered to be a very bad idea. If you hold your belief dogmatically, then in essence you don't even know what you believe. You don't know why you believe what you believe. You just don't question it. And as we found out from Socrates long ago, the unquestioned life is simply not worth living. If our beliefs are worth holding in the first place, then they should stand up to challenge. And if they can't, if they're flawed, then we should be willing to get rid of them. Again, this is the hallmark, remember. I mean, this is the characteristic of a civilized adult. Barbarians don't question. Okay. Mill's defense of the freedom of the individual, and that really is the big takeaway here. Mill's defense of the freedom of the individual received a lot of criticism. I mean, today we take it to be really, as I said, a core belief in democratic thought. But it's still challenged today, and it was very much challenged at his time. And so we're going to look at some objections to Mill's view and the responses that he gave, because they're also very enlightening. And in particular, there are 5 objections that we'll look at. The first is, isn't this just selfish? Isn't this just a childish view? Who are you, in other words, as one individual, who are you? What right do you have to tell the rest of society to back off? Why do you think you're so important? Aren't you just behaving like a petulant child? And Mill's answer is no. This is not selfish. It's certainly not childish, but it's definitely not selfish because, first off, there are limits. As you went further in the Mill reading, you saw that he does impose limits on individual freedom. There are limits in the public sphere, and there are obligations that we have even with this extensive liberty. We do, in other words, owe something in return to society for having our rights protected, for living in an organized state where we can flourish. So for Mill, we still have to pay taxes, right? That's still legitimate. We still might have to serve in the military. In many societies, military conscription or military service is mandatory. And Mill says there's nothing wrong with those things because this is give and take. We are benefiting by having this extensive freedom, so we owe something back to society. So it's not just one-sided as a child would have. and it's not selfish. But what makes it really important, and this is the key part of, I think, Mill's answer is the promotion. I'm going to leave it as he puts it. The promotion of indifferent benevolence is crucial to any advanced society. Here, the word indifferent doesn't mean you don't care. What it means is non-biased. You don't have a bias. And benevolence means goodwill. So, being non-biased, being fair, and giving other people the benefit of the doubt, being open-minded, and open-minded in a way that you're willing to learn from the ideas of others if you find them to have merit. This is what makes us a civilized society worthy of having our freedom of thought and conscience, our freedom of assembly, and our freedom of taste and pursuits, to have all that stuff protected by the state. So, for Mill, remember that connection that we had between essential liberties in paragraph 2 and to whom those liberties applied, and for Mill, again, this connects directly. Second objection that was raised to Mill is perhaps, I'm just going to summarize it by saying, referring to a famous quote by the British poet John Donne. You actually pronounce it Dunn, not Don. Who, and you may have heard this before, expressed the idea that no man is an island. No man is an island. That is, we exist in a society. We don't exist all by ourselves. Response is, because remember what Mill's doing is he's defending the individual, right? He's saying the individual deserves their own private space, in a sense. No man exists in an island, though, is the objection. So how can you call for individual rights to tell people to back off when we're all part of a network? And Mill's response is, it's true. It's true that we are parts of societies and communities. And sometimes, it's also true sometimes, that what we believe are private actions, they can actually spill over into the public sphere. That is, we think it's only affecting us and people who volunteer to come with us, but sometimes it has effects on others without their free and voluntary, undeceived consent and participation. And here you might think of something like, like internet sites, where people choose to click on what they click on, but if they don't really know that what you're doing is spreading a falsehood, then that's not a private action anymore. You are deceiving the person, so that's actually in the public sphere. Or you can think about things like media broadcasts, something you might find on a television channel or a cable channel, or any sort of internet stream, or even on radio waves, things like that. Those audiences are really sort of unlimited. So although, the case can be made, you choose to turn on that channel and watch that program. What happens if a kid does that? What happens if a kid watches a station that promotes hate? Is that then still the right of the station or the individual broadcaster to go ahead and express that? Well, that seems to be in the public sphere rather than the private sphere now. Okay, so it's true. Sometimes what seems to be private actually goes into the public sphere. However, in those cases, Mill argues, the problem is not the policy of protecting individual freedom. The problem is the poor judgment of the individual who's not recognizing their limits. So we should not punish the policy of individual freedom. Rather, the one who deserves punishment is the individual who didn't recognize their limits, the individual who didn't give proper consideration to the thoughts and feelings of others, who overstepped their bounds. Third objection to Mill was, what about people with bad habits, or people who have low aims in life, or people who have just sort of weak characters? They perpetually make bad choices. Shouldn't society be able to tell those sorts of people what they can and cannot do? And Mill's response to this is of course going to be no, but uh, it's going to be no on a multiplicity of levels. So he gives a multi-layered response here. No, even these people with bad habits and so forth, we can't restrict their freedom because, first off, society already had its chance to create better citizens when these individuals were in their formative years, when they were children. So we created these monsters and now we have to live with them, right? So he really does think it's important to create the right conditions for creating, pardon me, for education in the early years of an individual's life, so that they can blossom into a productive adult who has good judgment. If we're not doing that, then that's our fault, and we got to deal with it. Second reason that he gives here is for people that have bad habits and aim low in life and so forth, is that, hey, in the long run, it's going to be the individual who's making these choices who suffers anyways. So we have to say, all right, you make your own choices, but you're going to live with these negative consequences, maybe bad health, or you're going to wind up in a dead-end job or something. We have to let them make their own choices. And finally, he argues that if you try to take these people with bad character and low aims in life and you tell them, no, you cannot do that, their most likely response is they're just going to rebel. That is, uh, they're going to do things that are damaging to society on purpose, and nobody gains there. It's counterproductive to them, and it's counterproductive to us. So again, we got to back off and let them make their bad choices. All right, objection 4. What about people who are bad role models, though? What about people who set bad examples? Others look at them in the media, for example, and see their bad behavior. Shouldn't society be able to to tell these sorts of people, you can't do that because others are following your lead? And Mill's answer, of course, is no. Even these people who set bad examples, they're bad role models, no, we cannot restrict their freedom because, in the private sphere, because as responsible and rational adults ourselves, we are capable of choosing our own role models. And further, the attentive person, if you're paying attention and you have good judgment yourself, you're going to recognize that following that type of behavior, following that person's lead, is going to produce for you these painful, these unhappy, and these degrading consequences. So, you're free to choose to go along with that role model, but, you're going to suffer if you do so. So you should have better judgment. Of course, one thing you might be asking, and this is a very good question, is what about role models? What about parents as role models? And this is a very good question, because sure, as rational and reasonable adults, we can choose our role models. But kids, right? They don't really have a choice of parents, and so what if their parents set bad examples for them? And here, uh, in a sense, what Mill's going to argue is that that's true and that's unfortunate, but society has to consider the welfare of everyone. So we don't just leave the influence of children and what they find to be important in life. We don't leave it just up to the parents. That the rest of society should also be concerned with children. The rest of society should also want children to have choices, to have open minds, because that's what a good society, a desirable society is all about. Okay, and finally, fifth objection to Mill is, well, there are borderline cases. There are gray areas between the private sphere and the public sphere, right? What about with children, cases with children? What about cases with mass media? What about cases where disinformation is purposefully being spread? Are these in the private sphere or in the public sphere? You know, it's kind of a gray area. So, shouldn't we, in distinguishing between these cases, private sphere or public sphere, shouldn't we just back off and see how everybody feels? Shouldn't we just allow society as a group to be the final judge of what individuals can do and cannot do? And what do you think Mill's answer is here? No. It's more like hell no, because for Mill, doing so plays right into the hands of his absolute worst fear, his nightmare, the tyranny of the majority, which he has basically a paranoia about. So he's going to reject, of course, that standard of what's allowed and what's not allowed. Okay, so in the end, we see then that Mill stands up for the individual. And he stands up for the individual by articulating why it's important to stand up for the individual and why the state has to respect individual freedom. So I hope you learned a little bit today about the influence of Mill in political philosophy and how what we broadly take for granted today in social democracies is really the product of some very important intellectual defense on the part of people like John Stuart Mill. So we'll talk again soon, and enjoy the rest of your day.